Ladies and gentlemen of the Econ Playground, boys and girls, we have a very exciting guest today. It's my old friend Tegan Truitt of 2.5 years. We've been friends now. We met at an IHS conference. And how about you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, thanks, Marcus. I'm super excited for this. I am a senior at Grove City College in Western Pennsylvania. I'm graduating in May with degrees in economics and philosophy. I was trying to pick up a math minor on the way too, because I think math's pretty cool, and it's also really good for econ grad school, which I want to do. But I studied abroad in the springtime, which made it so that I can't get the math minor, so I'm kind of just grabbing a bunch of random math electives too, but I'll have like all these math classes as well.
I'll tell you though, the math minor is useful for econ grad school, but this book is more useful. Schaum's Introduction to Mathematical Economics. Just like do these the summer before grad school, and you'll be like totally set for the
okay, awesome.
For everything you need. Yeah, just Lagrangians. Just know Lagrangians like the back of your hand, and then you'll be good. Yeah.
Okay.
So what we're here to talk about today is somebody that I know that Tegan has always been interested in, and he's one of those guys that you kind of hear about every once in a while. Like you see he's cited, and someone's like, "Oh, the tacit dimension" or whatever, or you read like, "Oh, this book," and he was so great. And so we're going to be talking about Michael Polanyi today. He's one of those guys that he can kind of skim under the surface, like I'll eventually read him, but I don't need to right away. But it's good to have somebody who has been hooked by Michael Polanyi, and I'd say Tegan has probably been hooked by Michael Polanyi in a similar way to that I've been hooked by William James.
Yeah.
So Tegan's just going to give us a quick rundown, probably under an hour, just greatest hits, kind of like greatest insights maybe of Michael Polanyi, and what if anybody's interested in learning more, what they should look up.
So it's funny how you mention people like coming across Michael Polanyi. You see him cited and stuff like that. That's actually what happened with me. I was reading The Constitution of Liberty by Hayek. I think my senior year of high school, and there's this quotation in it from The Logic of Liberty by Michael Polanyi, and I was like, that's a really like weird and kind of intriguing quotation. And so like Polanyi hopped on my back burner then, and I was just like, I kind of forgot about him, but like I recognized the name when I saw it in other places. And then I was checking out some books from the epistemology section my freshman year at college, and his book was sitting right there, this little volume of 3 lectures called The Tacit Dimension. And so I picked that up and I read it over the weekend, and it blew my mind. So then ever since then, I've kind of become a card-carrying Polanyian, and I've read most everything he's published in books and a great many of his articles as well. So I think what got me so excited about him originally when I read The Tacit Dimension was his position as a diagnostician of the ailments and pathologies of contemporary civilization. And this quote's so good. I'm just going to read it because I don't want to botch it. So this is from The Tacit Dimension, right in the very beginning. And he's describing how he came to turn to philosophy. Because Polanyi began as a chemist. He was a chemist for like 20 years. And then kind of like almost randomly, it seems like, he goes to this professor where the administration who he's friends with at the university where he's working, and it's like, hey, I actually want to do philosophy now. Can we do this? And the guy's like, yeah, sure. And so he makes him a chair of philosophy there.
So that's great. That's not how it works anymore. That's not how it works anymore.
Right. Alas.
Yeah.
So he does that. And so in the beginning of The Tacit Dimension, he's trying to describe how he turned to philosophy so late in life. And what he says is, I first met questions of philosophy when I came up against the Soviet ideology of Stalin, which denied justification to the pursuit of science. And so he recalls a conversation that he had with Bukharin, a Soviet rocket scientist, who was in the Communist Party. And Bukharin told him that under socialism, the conception of science pursued for its own sake would disappear, for the interests of scientists would spontaneously turn to the problems of the current 5-year plan. And Polanyi thinks this is very, very problematic because it denies any ground for claiming freedom of thought. There's no room for the scientific exercise of freedom in a world where all science is predetermined by the dictates of the current 5-year plan. And then what Polanyi thinks is really chilling is that this same anti-scientific mentality is dominating in the West. And this is just the spectacular quote that got me hooked. He says, "It seemed to me then that our whole civilization was pervaded by the dissonance of an extreme critical lucidity and an intense moral conscience, and that this combination had generated both our tight-lipped modern revolutions and the tormented self-doubt of modern man outside revolutionary movements. So I resolved to inquire into the roots of this condition." So he sees this double-pronged attack, this rabid moral conscience of people seeking moral righteousness in everything, and this is motivating the revolutionary mindset that fosters all these attempts to reconstruct society from the ground up in a more progressive and enlightened fashion. While at the same time, there's this like wholesale rejection of any serious kind of discussion about values because of the prevailing epistemology that pervades, which denies any sort of like legitimate knowledge about aesthetic or moral or religious values altogether. Mm-hmm. And this double combination has produced the state of affairs that we find ourselves in Polanyi's time and through today, especially in the academy.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that quote that you said by the Soviet scientist was very interesting. And so he's essentially saying something like, when we get rid of all these the private social sphere, when everyone is in the same has the same collective economic interests, every scientist's research agenda will line up with the national economic agenda or national productive agenda. But
right.
And I think that's interesting because it shows what that same person, Bukharin was his name.
Mm-hmm.
It'll show what he also thinks about how scientists act in a capitalist society, in that they're only researching what they're researching because of whatever private interests is in infecting their mind or something like that.
Right.
So it's saying that this person actually doesn't believe in freedom, in a sense doesn't believe in freedom in either sphere, because now of course we have a budget constraint, or there are costs to various different behaviors. As economists, we can kind of still talk about that kind of thing, but to say that it's the way that you think is wholly 100% determined by something as specific as economic interest, right, or the mode of production, there's still some leeway and some freedom there. And so when they see no freedom in the market system, so they don't seem like they're losing anything by shifting to the other system.
Right, exactly, yeah. So, and that's actually one of the major points Polanyi makes, because he sees in the hostility to pure science a argument in microcosm that is the same argument being made against liberty in general. So the argument that the Soviets employ against academic freedom end up being paralleled in arguments against social and political freedom generally.
Mm-hmm.
So on the one hand, you have this intense moral conscience side of things, right, where there's this massive amount of pressure upon scientists to turn their attention to problems that are going to have some kind of practical significance for people. And one of the examples Polanyi brings up is like, there's all these like cool things going on in physics and chemistry that are just really abstruse, esoteric kinds of problems that don't have any obvious practical significance for the real world. And so you have this large amount of public clamor for scientists like, stop counting the number of electrons in the universe and start figuring out how to solve world hunger, things
Mm-hmm.
like that. So you have that kind of like moral attack against pure science. And then you also have, and this is what's really echoed in the Bukharin statement, this notion of, as you pointed out, scientific interests being wholly determined by a material substrate of reality. And so the view is that there's just not really any scientific freedom in the first place. So if it doesn't exist, it can't be some kind of value that we're striving to uphold. So it's this double-pronged attack. On the one hand, you have scientists are doing everything wrong because they're ignoring all the pressing moral problems we face. On the other hand, scientists can't do anything but what the material interests say. And so there's really no scientific freedom in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And then what's going on is in the society as a whole, you have this argument coming from mostly progressive academics that on the one hand, society's institutions are really bad, and they allow for freedom in all these abhorrent ways that are producing these terrible outcomes for different kinds of marginalized groups. And so the institutions of society are giving way to oppression, basically. They're just means of institutionalizing oppression. So morally, we have to do away with these institutions and replace them with something else. Mm-hmm. And then at the same time, you have this view that's offered oftentimes by the same people, which is that the institutions of society are determined wholly by the material substrate of society. They're responses to the economic interests of everything that's going on. And so there's really not any kind of freedom of individual action in the first place. So we're not giving up much when we jettison.
Okay, hi folks at home. We were having some technical difficulties, but I think we're gonna keep pushing forward with the videos off just to explain what's going on. But okay, how about you tell us a little bit about biographical information about Polanyi? Who was he? What did he do? When did he live? Where did he live? Just the different basic factors of his life, so that we get a context for the way he's thinking.
Definitely, yeah. So he was born in, I actually don't know the year off the top of my head, 1890s, 1880s, late 1880s or 1890s, sometime in there. And he grew up in Hungary. It was actually where he's from. And then he was always kind of an outsider in the university. So he published a paper in chemistry when he was 19, having never actually been to university or done anything there. But he keeps working in chemistry because he's just really, really smart, knows a lot about it, to the point where he's actually hired and becomes a university professor. And he jumps around from different colleges, different universities in Europe, eventually fleeing from Nazi occupation and ending up in Oxford, which is where he is, I believe, when he ends up turning to philosophy.
Okay.
So he's this chemistry guy for a very long time. It becomes a very famous chemist, and several of his children became also very, very famous natural scientists. So that was kind of his main deal. But he became so worried about the state of science, and then realized these parallels between like the threats to scientific freedom and the threats to social freedom altogether, that he decided he needed to turn his career around and focus primarily on philosophy.
And what year was that? What was the transition year to philosophy about?
So he says in the Tacit Dimension that he first turns to philosophy in 1935 when he had this conversation with Picard, and that's what got his interests going in it. He didn't make the academic transformation until sometime in the mid-40s. I'm not certain exactly what the year is, but his first major philosophical work came out in 1946, which is Science-Based Society.
Okay. And okay, but now if we think about him in the context of philosophy generally, would we say, like, is he an empiricist or a rationalist? Does he fit into any of those? Like, I know those are pretty strict camps, but does he fit into any of those camps? Like, and who would you consider, like, at the time, his philosophical friends? Not just people that he would have known directly, but maybe in the past, who would he have a spiritual kinship with?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So it's hard to say with Polanyi because he's not trained as an academic philosopher, which is kind of why, as you point out, like you only kind of see him in footnotes and stuff. Like there's not a lot of people reading him or anything like that, because he doesn't really use the philosophical vocabulary of his day. But we
wasn't
know
a system builder. You could say he wasn't a system builder.
Right, he was not a system builder, and he didn't participate in the lingo and the jargon of the system builders. So we do know that he read very extensively because he quotes all these different philosophers and stuff. As far as the rationalism versus empiricism goes, he's really neither. His whole object of philosophy is to reject the project of the Enlightenment.
Great.
Now, he does have some really good things to say about Enlightenment thinkers. Like he says once of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, he writes that to have been studying philosophy for so long and to not have read the Critique of Pure Reasons is like having been to Egypt and not seeing the pyramids.
Yeah.
So he has some really good things to say about some of Enlightenment philosophy. But I think you could put him in the camp of almost alongside like the Scottish common sense philosophers and people like that, who just reject the whole project of the Enlightenment altogether. Because the story of the Enlightenment is one where you have, let's say it begins with Descartes. That's wrong. It begins with Hobbes, but it really takes off with Descartes, who is emphasizing the attempt to transcend oneself you have this radical contingency of belief that Descartes recognizes in his years as a mercenary. And Descartes' really concerned about this radical contingency of belief because everywhere you go, people have different beliefs. And if you were born in a different time or place, you probably would have different beliefs than what you have right now. So how can we be sure, like, what's true? So Descartes wants to avoid a pluralism with this problem of beliefs still being radically contingent. And so he tries to transcend his own contingent place in history and find some universal starting point for knowledge to begin at. So that's kind of where the foundationalist project really begins, or at least where it takes flight. Mm-hmm. And everyone else in the Enlightenment looks at Descartes and they're basically like, you suck, you failed miserably at that, and attempts to offer their own system in replace of, and it's sure to replace Descartes' kind of failed, broken rationalist system.
They all thought that he failed, but they didn't think that his question didn't need to be answered, which was which is why we consider them continuing from him.
Exactly. So then the empiricists, Descartes in the rationalist camp, the empiricists come up to this and they're just like, well, we need to begin from a different set of properly basic foundational beliefs. But they still continue in that same tradition, right? They're trying to answer the same question that Descartes asked. Mm-hmm. And so Polanyi belongs to a strain of thought that is, I guess, in one sense, much more postmodern, and in another sense, much more pre-modern. Right. Where the whole idea is to ignore that question of how do we transcend ourselves and get to it like a universal starting point of belief. Instead, we just have to take a bunch of things we know for granted. He says in some places, all learning proceeds by an act of faith. Mm-hmm. He repeatedly quotes St. Augustine on this. He's a huge fan of Augustine's "I believe so that I may understand," and that's Polanyi's whole project, is to resurrect the legitimacy of holding beliefs about things, even in the absence of some kind of universal starting place that everyone can agree on. Yeah,
that's very interesting. And you were going to say something about the empiricists. I think I cut you off, or the empiricist way of looking at him, because there has to be something that he would roughly have an affinity with them being, an experimental scientist, and taking from that tradition of hypothesis, research, data, conclusion. He did something roughly in that field house when he was a chemist.
Yes, absolutely. So he talks a lot about this, actually. And what he says is that scientists aren't actually, they're not empiricists in the Enlightenment sense of being empiricists. Mm-hmm. This is where he introduces his concept of tacit knowledge, which is probably what he's most famous for.
Right.
That's knowledge that isn't known propositionally. And it might even be impossible to express it propositionally. It depends on what kind of knowledge we're talking about. Other philosophers have called to this know-how knowledge, so that's a certain type of tacit knowledge. And he thinks that science rests on all of these tacit, non-propositional foundations. So while, yes, the scientific method is deeply empirical, it is just the surface level operation of a bunch of other kinds of knowledge that can't be empirically derived or empirically represented. Mm-hmm. So the scientist has to exercise a number of different skills that honestly most closely approximate aesthetic judgment when they're operating in a laboratory, mm-hmm. Or choosing what kind of research practice to pursue, where to direct their interest and their time. There aren't formalizable rules that tell them how to get the answers from what they're interested in, or to decide what to be interested in the first place, things like that. So while scientific empiricism does operate according to a set of formalizable rules that are good in a certain context, Polanyi thinks that it's a mistake to assume that all knowledge can be reduced to these formalizable rules, let alone even empirical scientific knowledge.
Yeah, very cool. When you were talking about aesthetic judgment there a little bit, I have that as a premonition in my mind of something that is worth describing better in other contexts. And one of the places that I unfortunately have not looked into deep enough, that our friend Jacob Hall has always told me, oh, you've got to read History of Astronomy by Adam Smith, which is this lecture that Adam Smith wrote and never published. And it was one of the few things that he didn't burn at the end of his life, of all of his
Oh, wow.
unpublished notes. And the first it's called A History of Astronomy. Oh, I wish I had it in front of me, because it has a much longer title that's something like it's A History of Astronomy, or an inquiry into the nature of aesthetic judgment, or something like that. And you go, oh, okay, I didn't know that you could just say or for those two different titles. You know? And then and the first section is Adam Smith talking about almost like the emotions of a scientist, or like the three are surprise, wonder, and admiration. And he says this is kind of, and he then, I really have not looked into it enough, or I can barely slog through it. There's probably a reason it was unpublished. It probably wasn't edited very well, but
Okay.
it's like a 90-page essay, and it's a description of all the history of astronomy from the ancient Greeks all the way up to Newton and maybe a little bit beyond, of describing the just like how these scientists went from this model of the solar system to this model of the solar system to this model of the solar system, and why they came to those beliefs. But it's in a sense about their aesthetic judgment, how they feel all these things fit together, you know. So that yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. Oh, I was just gonna say that's so awesome and so interesting. Especially because Polanyi does the same thing. I don't know if he actually read Smith here, but in Polanyi's magnum opus, Personal Knowledge, which is where he kind of lays out the whole of his epistemological view, he begins by critiquing the Enlightenment notion of objectivity, insisting that it should be jettisoned, specifically because it fails to describe how scientific process goes. And his big example from this is astronomy. So he starts out with Copernicus and talks about how Copernicus's passion for the greater beauty of the heliocentric solar system is what led Copernicus to make his judgments, even in the face of evidence that was at the time conflicting with the Copernican model of the solar system. And then he goes into talks about Galileo and Kepler, and actually quotes at length from Kepler's journal, where Kepler says, here, I've got it open right here. Kepler made this major astronomical discovery, and he says, so now since 18 months ago the dawn, 3 months ago the proper light of day, and indeed a very few days ago the pure sun itself of the most marvelous contemplation has shone forth. Nothing holds me. I will indulge my sacred fury. I will taunt mankind with the candid confession that I have stolen the golden vases of the Egyptians in order to build of them a tabernacle to my God, far indeed from the bounds of Egypt. If you forgive me, I shall rejoice. If you are angry, I shall bear it. The die is cast, the book is written. Whether to be read now or by posterity, I care not. It may wait 100 years for its reader, if God himself has waited 6,000 years for man to contemplate his work. So like Kepler's just so excited about these astronomical discoveries that are occurring. And Polanyi's whole thesis is that this kind of excitement, these heuristic passions to discover new things that scientists hold, are really what motivates scientific discovery, and not the kind of rigid implementation of a set of functional rules that describe how to get a certain amount of output from a kind of input.
That's fantastic. That's awesome. And so you've been mentioning mostly the tacit dimension stuff and the tacit knowledge and personal knowledge. The only other, and you're right, that is probably the thing he's most well known for. The other thing he's well known for is the concept of the Republic of Science. And I've never gotten a good grasp on what that means. People just say like, oh, there's freedom to think. Oh, why is the Republic of Science different than people's normal notion of freedom of speech?
That's such a good question. So honestly, I think that's a hard question to answer, and this might be a controversial answer for Polanyi circles. I'm not actually sure, but I'm going to take a stab at it. I think it has to do with Polanyi's notion of conviviality. Okay. So he sees truth as this convivial experience where you have a number of scientists or inquirers in any kind of discipline. It doesn't even need to be hard natural scientists. That's as you usually think. Coming together and trying to share their respective insights on shared problems of interest as a whole. And so the distinction of the Republic of Science is the common purpose that all of the inquiries of scientists bear upon. That interest being the pursuit of truth for its own sake. And so all the scientists share in this great experience of discovery, whereas there's not as much of an interest in common truths in free inquiry in general. So freedom of speech is, that's the freedom to express what you will, subject to certain kinds of limitations. And the free society should be characterized by freedom of speech, but the free society is not going to have the convivial kind of existence that the Republic of Science holds.
And that, so in essentially, that reminds me of, if you let me stick my nose in here, Charles Peirce's concept of the community of inquirers. So in a sense, what Peirce ended up defining reality as is as the final resting place of all the scientists who are honestly doing science. When they converge on a point, that's the point that we call reality. Reality doesn't really have to do much with outside of the process of people learning. Reality is the final product of learning, whatever it is.
Yes. Yeah.
With an understanding that furthering science is a good idea. We don't need to say like, oh, finally we got reality, full stop, We have the learning process, we put ourselves in it. We have the community learning process, which is all of us doing our different experiments and arguing about them. But we have the understanding that these converge to a final resting place. And that's what we call reality. And that's what our goal is. It doesn't even matter so much if that is in time in some kind of way. But with that understanding that these ideas converge, motivates us to continue moving forward. And we can understand ourselves as moving closer to truth in time. It doesn't even matter if we get there.
Yeah, that's such a great point, and I think Polanyi would agree with that wholeheartely. It's really interesting. You said that was Peirce?
Yeah, that was Peirce. But Peirce, dude, is a crazy guy. So he I just finished a book called The Metaphysical Club that was about the pragmatists, and yeah, Peirce, at least in his personal life, was the most scattered. And he never held a job after a certain point. He was always like starving. William James had to like give him like a loan a couple times, to keep him alive. But William James attributes all of his philosophy to Peirce, which is crazy. Not all of it,
Wow.
but a good chunk of it.
Wow, that's bonkers.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a lot of secondary scholarship. All of it's readable for free on the Polanyi Society's website, their journal Tradition and Discovery.
We'll link that in the description below, I'm sure.
Yes, absolutely. It's really great stuff, and there's a ton of secondary scholarship actually relating Polanyi's work to C.S. Peirce's, as well as William James's, though less going on there.
Cool.
And yeah, there's this very deep affinity between the ideas of Michael Polanyi and the American pragmatists. Though it's strange to see that this affinity is never explored, to my awareness, in the works of either party. Like, they more or less kind of independently came to very similar conclusions, but discussed these conclusions in very different vocabularies, and did not seem to interact over much.
Yeah, for the pragmatist's sake, at least, it's explained, or at least the classical pragmatist, it's explained simply by the fact that they died before Polanyi started working, except for John Dewey, but he was busy doing his own other things, really. And
Okay.
I don't know, but yeah, but that period that Polanyi was working the most heavily is known as sort of the dark ages for pragmatism, where nobody was really paying attention to William James anymore, and pragmatism became much more in vogue in the 80s, actually, again. So
interesting.
it's kind of they never had the timing right, so they never got together,
Yeah, that must be it. The pragmatists just never rose to Polanyi's attention when Polanyi was working, and then of course he came after them.
Yeah. Okay, very cool. And okay, let's go a little bit in another direction, where you mentioned that he was very much inspired by Augustine, and that he had a description that all of science is built on various acts of faith. Can you go a little bit further into that? What was his personal religious life like? Did he have any works on a general description of his religious beliefs, or was he part of any churches or anything like that?
Yeah, so his religious life is also a matter of controversy and question. So it's known about him that he was raised and practiced as a Roman Catholic for a very long while, for most of his life, possibly all of it. Was baptized in a Roman Catholic Church, had his children baptized there, certainly went to Mass. It's also known that he, or at least reported, he carried the Anglican Book of Common Prayer in his breast pocket everywhere he went, which is really interesting there. And he has all of these strange allusions to religion in his major works. So, for instance, Personal Knowledge concludes with this almost bizarre remark that comes out of nowhere. He's summarizing in his last chapter the whole of his epistemological work. And he says in the end, in his last two sentences, we may envisage then a cosmic field which called forth all these centers by offering them a short-lived, limited, hazardous opportunity for making some progress of their own towards an unthinkable consummation. And that is also, I believe, how a Christian is placed when worshiping God. And then he ends the book right there with like that final cryptic remark.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's very badass of him, I think.
That's the same way that William James would talk, where like there were these essays where he'd just go, okay, it's time for battle. And then you'd go, oh, okay, where's the battle? And he goes, and he's like, do you hear the trumpet? And I go, yes, I hear the trumpet. And you go, oh, where is it coming from? I don't know what's going on. That's how he ends his essays. And I think they liked doing that because the style of philosophy that they were doing was inviting you to do the inquiry for yourself. So they never want their concluding paragraph to be your concluding paragraph.
So that's such an interesting take. I really like that. That's cool.
Yeah. Okay. Now the other dimension of Polanyi that we have not really talked about at all was, I've got two questions here. One, what exactly was his relationship with Hayek? Because right at the beginning, you mentioned that you first heard of Polanyi through Hayek citing him. And then, and I know that Hayek was interested in him. And then I don't know how much he was interested in Hayek, but what exactly was their relationship there? And then what was the deal with him liking Keynes? What's up with that? Because that's the kind of downside of Polanyi that I've always heard of. Not that it makes him such a terrible guy. And maybe he had some points, Keynes or whatever, but what's the deal with that? Because I've heard people say he was a chemist, a philosopher of science, and an economist. Sometimes I hear people say. So, what was his economic opinions? Where did they come from? What were they like?
Yeah, those are two good questions. Okay, so first of all, with respect to his relationship with Hayek, it's not super clear to me because we know that Hayek and Polanyi wrote back and forth to each other for 30 years.
Wow.
But the correspondence is kept under lock and key. Hayek's by the Hoover Institution and Polanyi's letters by the University of Chicago. So I can't read those. And there is one paper out there in existence that describes what was going on between them. But that paper is behind a paywall that I have not figured out how to get past yet. So
give me the title. Maybe I can get it through GMU.
Okay, that would be awesome. One sec, I will look it up real quick. I don't actually remember what the title is off the top of my head, but I'm on my computer here.
Or if you find it later, I can put it in the description too.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah.
Sure.
I'll look it up after our meeting here,
Great.
and let you know. So
yeah.
So the relationship is somewhat mysterious, and to compound the controversy, there are journal articles of scholars going back and forth as to who are arguing over who uses the term spontaneous order first. So, so spontaneous order is the thing that they're both interested in, and I assume that's what they're talking about when they write back and forth. So Hayek in 1945 publishes his very famous paper, one of the most cited papers in economics, The Use of Knowledge in Society, which is a brilliant paper and everyone should read it, even if it's not an economist. And in there he talks about the price mechanism spontaneously coordinating resources, but it's not spontaneous order in the sense of like any sort of fully fleshed out developed concept. Those words aren't used next to each other in Hayek there. Hayek starts using the words in the Constitution of Liberty, where you have the quotation from Polanyi's The Logic of Liberty, spontaneous order. So at the very least, when Hayek starts fleshing out the concept later in the Constitution of Liberty, and then subsequently in Law, Legislation, and Liberty, and then finally in his perhaps apocryphal writing, what's the last book he wrote? Fatal Conceit. When he uses that book there, uses the term in that book there, it's definitely Polanyi inspired, because he quotes Polanyi when he first starts fleshing out this term. At the same time, it's not clear exactly how much they agreed or disagreed with each other on the salient features of spontaneous order. So Hayek conceives of it in a rather economic sense, which is understandable because he's trained as an economist primarily. And specifically, he uses it to refer to emergent features of societies as a whole. So the distribution of goods coordinated by a price mechanism, which is an epistemic function that reveals the relative scarcity of different kinds of goods. For Hayek, that's a spontaneous order, the efficient direction of all goods into their most productive outputs without central direction. So I don't think Polanyi would disagree with that, but I think the concept is a little more robust for Polanyi. He talks about it in various different senses. So his first example of spontaneous order, of course, is in The Logic of Liberty, where he's talking about the Republic of Science, where science is not directed by any sort of central manager, but rather is the coordination of interests through the spontaneous development of scientists being allowed to pursue their own ends. So in that sense, the Republic of Science functions very similar to entrepreneurs in a market economy. And Hayek perhaps is taking the Polanyian notion of this broad concept of spontaneous order and applying it specifically to the market. Also, though, Polanyi has this very well fleshed out notion of emergence, where this might take us very far afield. So actually, maybe we can come back to this. I'll answer your other question first.
Okay.
All that to say.
Write down to remember emergence. Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
All that to say, Polanyi, Hayek, interesting relationship, controversial, lots going on there. Would love to find out more.
Mm-hmm.
With respect to Keynesianism and economics, Polanyi, so I think here's where Polanyi goes wrong on economics. He accepts that there is a divide methodologically between micro and macroeconomics, and that the macroeconomy behaves according to different sorts of principles. And that makes it easy for him to buy into Keynesianism. On microeconomics, however, he's astonishingly similar to the Austrians, especially given that in The Logic of Liberty, he offers a critique of Soviet socialism that very similarly parallels Mises' 1920 economic calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth.
Interesting.
And Hayek's use of knowledge in society, where the price mechanism is a coordinating mechanism that expresses informational values of the relative scarcities of different goods. And the attempt at socialism undoes this information relaying, so that the Soviet economist is in the unenviable state of having to almost arbitrarily allocate resources.
Mm-hmm.
So Polanyi gets very good on understanding the price mechanism and things like that. But he's not an economist by trade, and I just don't think he gave enough thought to economic methodology, which makes it very easy for him then to accept the prevailing methodology of the time, get caught up in the Keynesian revolution, and you have this stark difference between micro and macro economics in terms of method that's since been shown to be kind of tendentious and spurious even.
And in a sense, new Keynesianism was the idea of adding some more robust micro foundations to Keynes's old theories, and in the first place. So yeah, it's that whole idea that you can separate those so radically was a pretty short-lived idea, honestly, in the Republic of Economic Science.
Right.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that you can basically forgive him for, because it if he continued on living today, he would probably accept the standard things that we've all accepted at this point. And he wasn't a trained economist, so.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Like, I'm so glad he stopped doing economics in terms of epistemology, because his work on epistemology is amazing. And like, I just want to have more of that. And, you know, I don't really care if he produces much more econ output.
Yeah. There was a really interesting video that Professor Betke shared around at one point. That was a video it was like a little animated video made or written or narrated by Michael Polanyi or something like that, that essentially described the Keynesian circular flow with these little like animated characters. And it's very much like, it feels very like 1930s, 1940s style, like animation, or like a little reel that they'd show in a school or something like that. So I'll put a link to that as well down below, because it's a really interesting, quick watch. Yeah. And I think I shared that with you at some point.
Yeah. You shared it with me, and I'd seen it before. The Polanyi Society has it on their website. Or I think that's
very cool. Okay, very cool. Okay, how about I'm gonna ask you, what's the deal with his brother Karl? Because this is another thing that Jacob Hall has said to me before. He said, who's gonna write the book someday about those two brothers and why they ended up having such wildly different opinions about the world? So who was Karl Polanyi, just really briefly? This video is about Michael, so Karl just gets short shrift. But who was Karl Polanyi really briefly, and why did he have such differing opinions from his brothers? And what do you see any similarities between their ideas?
Yeah, so Karl Polanyi was another brilliant thinker who did primarily like economics and social science broadly, but departed radically from Michael in that he was very, very progressive, very, very left-leaning, and thought there was a lot of value to the whole socialist project.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not really in a position to comment on their personal relationship. The most I know about it comes from a biography I read of Polanyi, excellent biography published by the Intercollegiate Studies Institute by Mark T. Mitchell. We can link that one as well.
For sure.
And in there, the biographical information is very, very brief. It seems like the pair had a very good relationship, personally, but just disagreed very sharply and radically on their positions they ended up taking with respect to society.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, I'm guessing here, and honestly, obviously, the explanation is bound to be multivariate. So this is probably just one causal factor in many, or one of many. But I think one thing that might be motivating and animating the differences between the two is the fact that Polanyi was just such a polymath. Michael Polanyi just knew so much about everything, like all these different subjects. You know, he did chemistry professionally and then philosophy professionally, and he dabbled in economics in the meantime, and definitely was conversant in theology and aesthetics. He has essays on aesthetics and like the metaphysics of art and paintings. And history. He knows, you know, a lot about history, and his whole book, the Study of Man, is an application of his epistemology to historiography.
Oh,
so
very cool.
Yeah,
I'm sure.
It's spectacular. So he's pulling knowledge from so many different fields and trying to unify it into a coherent whole. And as far as I understand Karl Polanyi's work, is Karl restrains himself more or less to the social sciences. And so then he ends up falling prey to a lot of the errors of contemporary social science that we still haven't really done away with. And just becomes very interested in the kinds of problems that social scientists are generally interested in, and employs the methods that social scientists generally use. And so you have Karl Polanyi's output, which is undoubtedly sophisticated and intelligent and nuanced, but is more or less what mainstream economists, anthropologists, sociologists are doing. And he lacks that kind of radical nuance that comes from the interdisciplinary capabilities of his brother, which I think puts him in a very different place, and for me personally, in a much less interesting and much more wrong place.
Mm-hmm. And his famous book was The Great Transformation. In like 2 sentences or 3 sentences, what was that about?
I don't actually know.
Okay, it was okay. At some point, there was a great transformation. That's all we know.
Yeah, I have not read any Karl. I've just read a little bit about them, like I said.
Okay.
I think the Great Transformation is about the. You know what? I'm not even going to take a guess at that.
Yeah.
I don't remember.
Something transforms at some point in history. I probably agree with that.
Yeah, that's a good thesis.
Okay, so let's end on something that you mentioned earlier, the Polanyi's concept of emergence, because I think a lot of people have been slowly talking about this and realizing this a little bit more, and I'm realizing it a little bit more in the realm of religion, and I'm more interested in that. But tell us what he meant when he talked about emergence.
Yeah, so emergence is one of the really great places in Polanyi where you can actually pin him down on a term. So often he invokes terms and then just does not give like a clear analytic definition of it. And then kind of uses a bunch of other words to describe this term. And so his writing is just a little messy and confusing. But when it gets to emergence, for whatever reason, Polanyi is crystal clear, which is just beautiful. So emergence in a sentence is an emergent system, or let's see, how should I phrase this? A system is emergent if and only if it is composed of a whole that has more features than just the sum of its parts, though relies on all of its parts to produce.
Okay.
So the characteristic or archetypical emergent system for Polanyi, and he details this in the last section of Personal Knowledge, is randomness. So you shuffle a deck of cards. Randomness is an emergent system that arises from the shuffling. It is completely determined by the position of every card within that deck. The random system is determined by that. However, if you were to specify the position of each card, the randomness would collapse. It would no longer be random because you actually know the position of every card, and so probability no longer applies. So randomness is an emergent property, this feature that is determined by all of the different parts of the whole, but is a feature only of the whole and not of any of the parts, and not even of the sum of the parts.
Yeah. That's very cool. This is a real moonshot, but that reminds me of one of the more early Christian ideas about free will was actually not so much about like an individual person, like are they determined by all the parts, but the fact that ultimately if you turn yourself towards God, you are determined by him. And that's more what they meant when they said something like free will, is that you're free of everything less than God. But that was a bit of a moonshot. But I don't know. I only see the connection like visually in my head. You know what I mean?
That I've never heard that before, but that sounds awesome. I really like it, and I think Polanyi would be like, I don't know. That sounds like one of the throwaway lines he put in one of his like fire paragraphs.
Okay, and to bring back Peirce, that reminds me of Peirce's metaphysics, which one of my plans this break is to read a couple of his papers in metaphysics, because one of his short sides was he never published a book. He never actually got anything off the ground, but he did publish some essays, and some of them were trying to describe his understanding of metaphysics based on emergent properties of different parts coming together and developing into like what we would now call natural laws, but he thought of it as evolving over time, what the natural laws that we're studying and believing in are. And that's great. So that's great. And yeah, and I think emergence is where a lot of people in many different disciplines, in psychology, in philosophy, in theology, in economics, are all turning and looking. And that seems to be like a 21st century idea that we just heard hints of in the past couple centuries, but that maybe they understood in a way much longer ago that they never even needed to say it. It was tacit knowledge to them. Yeah. Very cool.
Yeah. So then with respect to tacit knowledge, emergence plays this very interesting role in that our explicit knowledge is emergent from tacit knowledge. So you have all of these, what he calls subsidiary knowledge, all these different pits of knowledge that we have, but we're not paying attention to when we're performing certain operations with our mind in order to get explicit knowledge. And so the explicit knowledge is what we have and it's what we're using, but it's emergent from all of these tacit subsidiary components. So then the attempt to reduce all our knowledge to what is explicitly or propositionally formalizable, like the logical positivists do and others of Polanyi's opponents, is to omit the whole emergent system of knowledge that we have. It's to omit all of the important tacit underpinnings from which our explicit knowledge ends up arising.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Very cool. Yeah, there's a lot more to dig here, and yeah, and so 21st century scholars, that's us, by the way. So we're gonna be talking about this a lot more in the future, I'm sure. But anyway, thank you very much for coming on, Tegan. It's been too long since we decided to do this, and yeah, anything else you want to plug or mention or anything like that?
Yeah, everyone should read The Tacit Dimension. It's super
Okay.
short, pretty accessible, and it's brilliant. It'll change your life.
I meant anything you want to plug that like you've written, but yeah, that works.
Oh, that I've written.
Or
I've got a cool paper on the origins of property rights that'll be available at the Austrian Student Scholars Conference website soon.
okay, very cool. Well, well, thanks for coming on, Tegan, and thanks for listening, our viewers. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Bye. Thanks, Marcus.